Hey, thank you very, very, very much. You're very, very kind. So about 3 months ago, I guess Pastor Brett knew he was going to be out of town, so he's thinking, oh man, I'm going to be gone. I want to leave him in good hands. So he was thinking, who is the smartest person I know who could come fill my pulpit? So we called him up, and they said no. So then he's thinking, okay, if I can't wow them with their brain power, how about if I get a best communicator I can find? Someone will just hold them at the end of their seats and they'll mesmerize them, and they called him up and they said no. So he's thinking, okay, if I can't find the smartest person, can't find the best communicator, let's find the best looking person I know and we'll invite them and they'll just watch the guy or gal for the whole half hour. And that person said no. So a couple weeks ago, Pastor Brett called me up and he said, would you come fill the pulpit? And I said, yes, because I felt bad for turning him down the 3 other times. So, I just thought I should come. 4 is a charm. So I've never been to Lakeland, Florida. What a great place. I've been to Orlando a few times, Miami a few times, Tampa a few times, but I feel like I know you a bit because I knew Pastor Brett and Mindy when they were just a young couple. I was on staff at a church in the Midwest, and it's those things when you meet somebody, you say, I'm impressed. And so, we kind of invited them to do some ministry stuff, and oh my gosh, little Jessica was only 3 years old. And Mindy dressed her up so cute. It was just like a little doll. And I just said hi to her. Hadn't seen her since then, so it's kind of amazing. And then I discovered that Colton, he served at a place called Nobu in Malibu. Now, I taught at Pepperdine in Malibu about the same time. I couldn't afford Nobu, but he was hanging out with the celebs there. And then, let's see, I discovered that Madison and her husband went to Olivet, where I graduated. I think I was a year or 2 ahead of them. And had a great time with Tyler and Katie. So anyway, I just feel like I know you a little bit. So in the series that Pastor Brett has taken you through called FIXER Upper, and I watched a lot of HGTV over the holidays too, so those things affect you. I listened to the message, and last week he talked to us about 4 attitudes that impair or impede the way we look at life and sometimes our relationships. So we're going to kind of continue this series, but I'm going to share with you today what I call the secret of people. And it is, I believe, the most important relationship principle I've ever learned. And as I study leadership, I think it's also important for us as leaders to understand it's probably the number 1 relational skill that either makes or breaks leaders. And a lot of it has to do with just how we deal with difficult people. Because anyone can be good with people who like them and are nice and they're positive, but how you deal with the difficult people, that's really like the litmus test to tell whether you make it or not. And obviously, there's a lot to do with Scripture on that, but there's also a lot to do with psychology, and we're going to kind of merge the two. So the idea of the secret of people, the law of love inside out, is kind of one of these things I discovered several years ago, and I've been sort of developing and learning a lot about it the last few decades. But it started on the 101 freeway. Now, if you want to study human behavior, just go to LA and drive on the freeway, right, Colton? Yeah, so I'm on the 101 freeway going south toward Hollywood, and I think pretty highly of my driving skills. I try to keep up the pace and maybe push the pace a bit. But apparently the guy behind me didn't think so highly of my driving skills that day, and he tailgated me. And the first opportunity, he pulled alongside me, and he made a gesture, which in our Western civilization means you're the biggest jerk I've ever seen, and he sped on down the road. Now, I'm about to tell him what I thought of him, and my wife, who was sitting beside me, so quietly said, he's not very happy, is he? I'm thinking, not very happy? Did you see that finger-slinging villain? He had no right to do that to me. So I'm fuming. So I make the exit under the checkered flag, as we do in LA, and pulled into an intersection. The lights were red, so like any law-abiding citizen, I stop. I pull forward a little bit to make sure, before I turn right on red, that there was no one coming. And this woman ridiculously thought that I was in her lane. And she screeched on her brakes and then melodramatically drove around the front of my car while mouthing, "Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year," or something to that effect. And I was about to tell her what I thought of her, and my wife said, she's having a bad day, isn't she? And I'm feeling a little betrayed by this point, right? And all of a sudden it hits me. You see, their unloving behavior towards me was not an indicator of my worth as much as it was an revelation, an insight into how they were thinking about themselves. And you see, it sounds like good pop psychology, but really it's grounded in a lot of good scripture and theology. And so we're going to unpack these things together this morning and give you some examples. So let me lay a foundation. The foundation is that all of us, the problem is that all of us were really made in the image of God. And I'm gonna point to the screen if you can advance there we go. Imago Dei. We are all made in the image of God. Now, that's really not a problem, but it's sort of the source when you understand why we see what we see in relationships. So one of the most popular Christmas gifts 2017 was Ancestry.com. You can find your roots, and we've seen the advertisements. But if you were to take this test and go back far enough, you'd find that we all came from the same gene pool, the same DNA, and that is, Scripture says that God made us in His image. So Genesis 1, 26, 27 says, in the image of God we were made, male and female. So we all have that sort of DNA that says you reflect God in some way. Now, when you go beyond that and you go to the New Testament, you realize that Jesus said in Mark 12:20, He says, you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. And He uses a unique word that we're going to define in a moment. But He just doesn't say you should love others. He says, as you love yourself. And in fact, when you think about it, it's kind of hard not to do that. If you're seeing a lack of love in your life or a lack of love in someone else's life, really what that is, it's an indicator. It's just like a gauge on your dashboard of your car that says you're low. Your gas is low, your fuel is low, and so therefore it becomes very difficult to love others sufficiently. So this morning, I want you to think in terms of, in your relationships, how can you look at people more through the window than through the mirror? So people who study the brain have discovered that we have these things called mirror neurons. The mirror neuron is parts of our brain that when we see someone in distress, we feel distress as well. It's why advertisers pick out a cute little baby and they put them in front of the camera and they smile and they chuckle because they know that when you see a chortling little smiling baby, you're going to feel good as well. It's the same thing when we feel someone who's anxious or someone who's distressed. It's what makes acting good. Actors who are good evoke that feeling in us, mirror neurons. Now that's how most of us tend to exhibit in our relationships, is we tend to reflect those around us. So when people are nice, we're nice. When they're anxious or upset or impatient, we feel those same things. But what if this year, instead of looking at people like in a mirror, what if we looked at them through a window? Where when they behave or misbehave, when they act with dishonor, when they're difficult to deal with, instead of mirroring back what we see, what if we saw into their soul and we realized they need some inner love? They are out of touch with how God created them, or they're out of touch with that DNA that He put them in them. I live about 7 minutes from the Reagan Presidential Library, just over the hill in Simi Valley. And there's actually this piece of the Berlin Wall there. It's been spray painted, and they actually put this piece of the Berlin Wall there, and President Reagan, when he was alive, and Gorbachev had their picture in front of it. Now, some of you remember the Berlin Wall. Some of you read about the Berlin Wall, you millennials, in a history class. But way back when, they divided Germany in half, and they had on the east the communists and dictatorship and all the stuff that went with communism. On the west side, it was free, democracy, and kind of a land of plenty. Well, one day, the people on the east side said, we'll tell the West what we think of them. And they threw a whole bunch of garbage and trash and manure on the other side. So a couple days later, the West Germans got together, and they, at the same gate, put beautiful displays of cheese and meats and beer and wine, and they left a little note, and it said, each gives what each has. And when you think about it, that's kind of true in all of life, is that we tend to give what we have. If you don't have sufficient agape for yourself, it is very, very difficult to give agape to others. We tend to give what we have. So if we reverse that, we realize that gives us an opportunity to sort of check up where we're at. So we're going to talk about the solution now. And let's look at 1 Corinthians 13. Now, you've heard this passage, read this passage ad nauseum. Valentine's Day is coming up. You're going to buy cards that have this in it. But we're going to read it, but we're going to look at it in a different perspective, a different nuance. It says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil. It rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Now, it's interesting because when we read this passage, we usually read it in the context of us loving other people. But Jesus and the New Testament, and here Paul, use the word agape to define what it is. So it's not so much, here's what you should be doing, as much as it is, this is what agape love is. Because in Jesus' day, they had many words for love. I mean, we have kind of like one word for love, right? We say, I love 3 tortellini stew. Or I love my church, or I love my wife, or I love the Marlins, or I love God. We love everything, but we know each of those loves is not really the same. Well, the Greeks had different words for love. Phileo, Philadelphia, brotherly love, friendship love, eros, erotic, sensual love. And agape was a word that was not widely used. And so Jesus sort of uses this word and defines it in a new way, and then Paul takes it to a new level. And he said, this is what God's love is, to choose to treat you with honor. Now it's interesting because he uses this word because you can't really evoke emotion. When you look at the concept of love, it's usually in terms of an emotion. You know, we look at a couple running into each other's arms through a flower-flung field, you know, violins in the background. We say, oh, I don't love them anymore. Oh, I do love you. But you can't evoke, you can't command someone to feel a certain way. You can't say, okay, now everybody be happy. All right, everybody be sad. I mean, we parents try that, and how well does that work, right? How's that working for you? As Dr. Phil would say. It doesn't work. But you can choose an action, and you can command an action. So that is why the scripture commands us to love, not an emotion or a feeling, but a choice. I choose to treat you with esteem and dignity. I choose to acknowledge the image of God in you, even if you cut me off, even if I don't agree with your religion, even if I don't like the way you treat me at work. Allowing us to now be empowered to make responses that God calls us to do. So we're going to unpack some of these together. And we're going to sort of untie just 5 of them. There are actually 13 of them in this little passage. But I'm going to untie and unpack 5 of them so you can kind of get a drift and you can look at 1 Corinthians 13 in a whole different way. Love does not boast. It is not proud. Now, I think this is one of those ones where when you look at it from the outside, you say, the braggadocious person, the proud person, they're in love with themselves. Yeah, they love themselves too much. I'd say probably not. It's actually a knockoff love, right? It looks like the real thing, but it's not. It's like 2 or 3 times we've taken little trips over the Bahamas, so we fly into Miami, take the boat over, and our last time there, we noticed that they've cleaned it up a bit, but as some of you who've been there years ago know, you used to go through the market, and you could find these beautiful Gucci bags for $39. You know, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to take 3 of them home. And we would take one home, and then whenever we'd see a Gucci bag, we said, they've been to Bahamas. They've been to the Bahamas. Well, obviously, they look like Gucci. They feel like Gucci, but they're really not Gucci, are they? They're knockoffs. And when you see someone who's proud, the proud person is really sort of demonstrating a pseudo-love, or what we might call fake love. It's faux love. If you've ever been to Las Vegas, you know what I'm talking about. You go to Paris, Paris. Well, if you look at Paris, Paris, and if you've ever been to the real Paris, you've seen the Eiffel Tower, you know they're very similar, but they're different. Or you've been to Caesar's palace and you realize that it looks like Rome, but we know it's really not Rome, right? So people who are proud are really wearing a mask. It's a facade. They're hiding something. Because one thing we notice of people who are proud is they're seeking other people's attention. They're trying to make themselves better than they really are. Why? Because they're insecure. And so they're trying to get people to applaud them because why? They depend on people's love. They depend on an external form of affirmation because they don't have the internal form of affirmation. In fact, it's also, when the person who's braggadocious, it's kind of like they're walking around on stilts. They're trying to make themselves better. Now, we're not going to unpack this one, but the next phrase says that love is not rude or does not dishonor. Rudeness is the inverse strategy than pride. Pride is about lifting yourself up so people would applaud you and say, oh, you're so smart. Oh, you're so good looking. Oh, you're so tasteful. Rude is the inverse. It's where you put people down. You say, oh, you gained a little weight lately. Oh, you came across a little short there. Oh, I don't know why the boss likes you. And all those little digs. Well, you see, the goal ultimately is the same, that you look better than everyone else in comparison. So whether you're lifting yourself up or whether you're putting other people down, it's an artificial attempt to try to regain your sense of value, who you are and how you were created. Love is not proud. Love is not self-seeking. Again, self-seeking, we say when someone is very narcissistic, very focused, self-centered, we say, oh, they're in love with themselves. But really, it's not true love. It's not godly love. So I don't know if you've ever lost something valuable. You're consumed with it, right? You lose your wallet, you lose your keys. Where'd my cell phone go? Where is that? Well, Luke 15, Jesus tells a parable of a woman who lost something very, very valuable. And she was consumed with trying to find it. She wouldn't eat. She asked everybody. And then when she found it, she rejoiced. The most important thing we have in life is our value, our worth. When a person is self-seeking, when they're always talking about themselves, when they're narcissistic, it's really an indicator, if you understand this principle, it's really an indicator that they have lost who they are and they're trying to get all the attention. They're trying to find it. So one of the neighbors of Colton and myself, when we lived near Malibu, is one of our selfie people, right? Social media. I mean, Hollywood is full of it, but it's not just Hollywood. It's kind of all of us. We sometimes in a coffee shop conversation, when we walk away, say, oh my goodness, this person always talked about themselves. I couldn't talk about myself. And we see these lopsided relationships. Well, if we understand what the real indicator is, that they've lost what's most important, then we will help them find it. And the secret of people is restoring that so that they can be replenished and they can learn to love. Jesus gave us a parable, not the parable, but Jesus gave us a lesson of this when he washed his disciples' feet. The Last Supper. He said, if you want to be great, right? Because they were sort of arguing, who's going to be great? Pride, self-centeredness, it was there. He said, do this. And he got down, he washed their feet. So really, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less and more of others. So a person who is narcissistic, a person who is bragging, a person who's always lifting themselves up, if we look through the window and not in the mirror, we'll realize that they are looking for what they've really lost. They need to find it. All right, let's go to another one. Love is not easily angered. The easily angered person is a person who is sort of stuck in defense mode. They are the person who is always looking at someone who's an enemy. If you could see this up close, you'd realize this is a hair trigger, literally is a tuft of hair. But this is a person who, whenever they're in traffic, whenever they're in a restaurant, whenever they're at line in Starbucks, they sort of see everyone else as a competitor. They're out to get them. They're out to defeat them. And so they're always sort of living with this hair trigger emotion of anger. Some of you were raised with that, and you know what it's like to have parents or maybe a sibling or maybe a spouse with this. Well, when you really unpack it, you realize that anger is a defense mechanism. And the person who feels insecure is always in defense mode. Scripture says in John 4:18, Jesus said, perfect love casts out fear. So when you're full of agape love and you recognize your origin, where your value's established, it allows you to take risks, and you realize that people don't have to snap at you or that don't jump at your requests. They don't always have to make way for you in the traffic. And it allows you to sort of relax and say, okay, I get this. And when I find myself snapping at my family members or wanting to tell the person in traffic what I really think of them, again, it's an indicator to say, okay, Alan, why do you have this need? What's going on inside of you? Maybe you need to fill up again. Because fear is a defense mechanism that when we live it out, we're always going to be on edge in our relationships. And usually what we see when we see someone who's easily angered is we get angry, right? And what does that do? It throws fuel on the fire. Because they're impatient, we get impatient. They're irate, we get irate. Instead, when you look through the window, you realize, okay, they're on fire. I'm going to put this fire out. And you can address their real need. And the real need in the moment is not for you to sort of give them something else to get angry about. It's to really support them and understand how they were wired and to honor them. Let's do another one. Matt, thanks for helping me. I don't know if my clicker's working. Love keeps no record of wrongs. It forgives. Forgiveness is a tough deal, isn't it? Especially when someone you know has injured you. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's someone that you grew up with, a friend. Okay. The person who is unwilling or unable to forgive others, usually, not always, but usually is a person who's not learned how to receive forgiveness as well. Again, Jesus talks about the unforgiving servants or the unforgiving manager, person who had been forgiven a huge debt but then was unforgiving toward his servant who had a small debt. And a lot of people who walk around with chips on their shoulder are people who sort of judge people according to their behaviors. And that's the interesting thing. Jesus never ignored the behaviors, but he saw the behavioral issues as something else. You see, in Genesis 9:6, after the fall of humanity, it still says we were created in the image of God. So sin mars the image of God, but it doesn't take away the image of God. That's why when we look at other people who may have lifestyles we don't choose to believe in or follow, or we look at people who have different religious beliefs or people who do business a certain way, their value is still there, even if it's smart, even if it's dirty. Even a dirty 25-cent piece is still worth 25 cents. And so at the end of the day, the person who's able to give forgiveness is probably a person who's able to give forgiveness. My eyes are not able to read this, but I love the quote on this little plaque. It says, holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So you see, we know that holding grudges is not good for us. So when you value yourself, you realize that sometimes the most important reason to forgive is just for your own benefit, for your own improvement. And having that ability to respond to people and forgive them, not because they ask you, not because they deserve it, but because you need it and you need to move forward, is one of the most therapeutic things you can do, not just for yourself, but also for your relationships as well. Let's do one more. Love perseveres. Keeps going when it doesn't receive itself in return. If you really think about it, most of us, or I should say most people, because I don't know you, but most people don't give love, they trade love, they barter love. Think about it. You smile at me, I'll smile at you. You invite me over to your house, I'll invite you over to my house. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. So really, that's not a definition of agape love, that's human love. Quid pro quo. You give, I give in return. But you see, Scripture says that agape love is choosing to love, period. It is love without strings attached. And in fact, really the only true way you know if the love you have is not some type of human love versus agape love is if you just love, period. You don't love because, you don't love when, You love, period. So if the person never invites you over, you still love. Invite them over. If a person never gives you a smile at a time of day, you still smile to them and greet them in the morning. So at the end of the day, it's the person who is able to understand that the person who gives up quickly at love has been hurt. The person who gives up quickly in love is probably dependent on human love and not God's type of love that is enduring and that perseveres. So let's review what we've learned today, okay? This is the secret of people. Or not. Everyone carries the DNA of God in them. God made you in his image, made your neighbor in his image, and it goes on and on and on for every generation. We also learned that we are to honor this in others as well as ourselves. Agape others as you agape yourself. As you recognize the godly DNA in you, you recognize the godly DNA in others. That's what honor is. And when people behave badly, when their external behavior is not loving or honoring, it is an indicator that they're low on their inner love, that they need some of what you can give. And that's really what honor is. It's giving them what they deserve and what they need, right? It's acknowledging the image of God in them so that as you honor them, you're replenishing their greatest need, and then they're far more likely to not only honor you back, but to honor others. And you don't do it so they'll honor you back, but the secret of people is that as you do this, they will typically do that. As I squeeze this sponge, water comes out of it. And I would ask you a question: why is water coming out of this sponge? You'd say, well, duh, it's because you're squeezing it. And I would say water comes out of the sponge because water is in the sponge. Because if there was milk in the sponge, milk would come out. If there was oil in the sponge, oil would come out. When life squeezes you, what comes out? When the traffic squeezes you, what comes out? When the mean, ruthless work colleague comes by your desk, what comes out? I would propose that what comes out is what is already in there. And what we want to do as change agents in society, what we want to do in our fixer-upper journey, is to do things differently. To realize that when people behave unlovingly towards me, it's a sign that they're low of inner love. And when I began behaving in a dishonoring manner to other people around me, it's a sign that I need to go to the Father and be reminded of who I am.